My name is Drew Greeno. Welcome to Week 10 of the NFL season. Here to bring you the action in the League of Legends fantasy football season. Hard to believe it's Week 10 of the NFL season. Also, Saturday marks the trade deadline for the League of Legends managers. So get those last-minute trade proposals in. You still have time to make a move before Saturday's deadline. That is the last chance for you to make a meaningful acquisition before the playoff push begins. Now, it was a big week last week. We saw Ryan get his first loss of the season. We saw Cam with a big victory over Sean to move up in the standings. And Dave Power might be making a late season run towards the playoffs. What will happen this week? Let's not waste any further time and get into the action as we see it. First matchup we're going to look at is a critical one in the League of Legends standings. Sean comes in with a record of 4-5 off a tough loss last week to Cam. He is facing off against Dennis, who had a big victory over Ryan to put himself in the playoff structure at the moment at a 5-4 record. We're going to first look at Sean's team. Looking at Sean's roster, he made a big trade with Dennis 2 weeks ago. He got rid of Drew Brees at his quarterback position. And the reason he did that is because he has a redhead named Andy Dalton, who is playing in the Monday night game this week against Houston. Dalton, believe it or not, has actually had a pretty decent season for fantasy purposes. He has been over 20 points the last few weeks, and I like for him to have a big game on Monday night. Houston is in shambles. It's a home game. They're undefeated. It's a primetime performance. The knock on the Bengals has been they have not performed well in primetime. They looked pretty good last week in the Thursday game, and I like for them to roll this week, and Andy Dalton will lead the way with multiple touchdown passes. Now, looking at Sean's team, I don't see a lot of guys with negative matchups, but one guy that I could foresee having a problem is Justin Forsett. Now, Justin Forsett had a pretty good game about 4 weeks ago. He was over 20 points, and ever since then, he's been down every single week since. Now, he had a bye week last week. He has a very favorable matchup against Jacksonville at home. It's a chance for him to come back strong, but I'm going to say that he's not going to have a good game because I've seen that trend the last 3 weeks, and I don't like where it's going. So that's going to be a guy I'm going to put in the down category for Sean's roster. Looking at Dennis's team, a guy who finally has come through now, finding the end zone last week, Adrian Peterson. He has a pretty decent matchup this week on the road against the Oakland Raiders. I like for him to get the ball. Bridgewater is banged up from a concussion last week. They're going to need Peterson to run the football to be effective in that game, and that bodes very well for Dennis's chances this week. Now, looking at the down category, this is a guy who's actually caught a touchdown pass in the last 7 games of the season. Hard to believe, but I'm going to put him in the down category this week. It's Allen Hurns. Again, pretty good matchup. He is playing on the road against Baltimore. We all know that their secondary has struggled, but he's dealing with an injury, and that's really the main reason why I'm putting him in the down category. He should play, but I believe he has a foot injury that has kept him limited in practice this week. So I'm going to say that his touchdown streak is going to come to an end this Sunday on the road at Baltimore. Now, looking at this roster for both Sean and Dennis, I'm going to take Sean to win this one. I think Sean's wide receivers are going to come through. I think he's going to get enough points from Dalton, and that's going to be enough to get him back to 500 at 5-5, also dropping Dennis to a 5-5 record. Next matchup we're going to look at is Ryan, who comes in with a record of 8-1, fresh off his first loss of the season. He is playing against Steve, who comes in with a record of 2-7. With Ryan, I'm going to stay with that Monday night game. I like DeAndre Hopkins, who is on the road against Cincinnati in that aforementioned Monday Night Football game. Really, the lone bright spot for the Houston Texans this year has really been the play of DeAndre Hopkins. He has played very well this year. He has easily jumped into the top 5 wide receivers in fantasy football conversation, and I like for that run to continue. I think he's going to have another big game in the spotlight on Monday Night Football. Looking at the downside, Kamar Aiken is home against Jacksonville. Now, looking at that, you got to say that that's got to be a pretty good matchup because Steve Smith is no longer in the equation, so Kamar Aiken moves up. But I just don't trust the player. Really, he was all I can think of with Kamar Aiken was when he was a special teams player many years ago for the New England Patriots. I just don't think he has the skills that are going to be warranted a start in fantasy football. So that's a guy Although it seems okay on paper, I'm going to go and take the negative side with Ryan's roster this week. Looking at Steve's team, a guy that should have a good game and historically has had a good game against the New England Patriots is Eli Manning, who will start at quarterback for Steve's roster. Now, with Andrew Luck down, you're going to see a lot of Eli Manning on Steve's roster moving forward. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think he's been pretty decent this year, and he has a very favorable matchup. You know that the Giants are going to come in ready to play. They traditionally have done well against the Patriots. They've actually won their last 3 games against the team, hard to believe. This is the only team that Tom Brady does not have a winning record against. It's because Eli Manning has played well in those contests, so I'm going to take him to play well again this Sunday in New York. Now, a guy that seems like he's taking the brunt of the carries and really the season is starting to take a toll on him is Doug Martin. He is playing at home against Dallas. Dallas's defense has improved recently. They did give up a lot of yardage to DeMarco Murray, but that's a much better running back in my opinion. Doug Martin, to me, is a guy that's only going to go down. I don't like where he's been at the last couple of weeks. He only had a couple points last week in a losing effort. So Doug Martin, for me, is a guy that I don't have a lot of stock in for Steve's team. Looking at this matchup as a whole, I just don't see any way that Steve's going to take this victory, so I'm going to move Ryan up to 9-1 on the League of Legends standings. Next matchup we have is Dave, who comes in with a record of 3-6. Big win last week for him against Cam, who was at 5-4. Had a very narrow but very effective win against Sean last week, moving to 5-4. Dave shrewdly picked up D'Angelo Williams last week. This week, he's playing against Cleveland. That's a very favorable matchup. We all know Ben Roethlisberger is not going to play in that contest. So their Steelers are really going to rely on D'Angelo Williams to have a big game. He's been very effective when he started. He was very effective that Week 1 game against the Patriots. He was very effective last week. There's no reason to believe that he's not going to be effective this week. Especially with Ben out, they're going to have to run the ball to be competitive in that ball game. So I like D'Angelo Williams to have a very good game on Sunday against the Browns. Looking at the downside, I'm going to stay at the running back category for Dave. Darren McFadden is on the road against Tampa Bay. Now, I know Darren McFadden had over 100 yards last week. On paper, it seems like a very favorable matchup. But at the same time, Tampa actually has done decently well against running backs in the last couple of weeks. Darren McFadden certainly has to contend with the fact that Matt Castle is at quarterback. And although that could be a good thing for him, I just don't think that he's going to crack the 100-yard mark this week. So I could see him somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 9 points as a whole, which isn't fantastic. It's certainly serviceable, but that's a guy for me that I'm going to put in the down category when you look at Dave's roster. Now, looking at Cam's team, he was able to make a trade with Bud a couple of weeks ago to acquire the services of one, Emmanuel Sanders. Emmanuel Sanders is at home against Kansas City. The last time Emmanuel Sanders played against Kansas City, he scored 2 touchdowns in a Thursday night effort. I like for him to find the end zone again. I know Peyton Manning's a little banged up right now. I don't think it's going to matter. Kansas City right now is really hit or miss in terms of their defense. Emmanuel Sanders, to me, is going to have a great game on Sunday. Looking at the downside, Chris Ivory had 2 touchdowns last week for the Jets, but only had 23 yards rushing on a whopping 21 carries. That is how we say ungood. You take away those touchdowns, and he is not an effective fantasy player right now. I don't think he's going to find the end zone. They're playing at home tonight against Buffalo. So for me, Chris Ivory is a guy that will not meet his projected total for Cam's team. Now, when you look at this matchup, on paper it looks like a Cam victory, but I like the strength of Dave's wide receivers this week. He's going to get another big win and keep his playoff chances alive, moving to a 4-6 record. Cam will now fall to 5-5 with a loss this week. Next matchup we have is myself, who has won 6 straight ball games, moving to 7-2. I will be facing off against Bill, who is coming in with a record of 2-7, 2 consecutive wins for Bill, who is starting to turn the corner, certainly after a very tough start to the season. Looking at my roster, a guy that actually Bill let go a few weeks ago is Michael Crabtree. Michael Crabtree is playing at home against Minnesota. Had a huge game last week with 2 touchdowns against the Pittsburgh Steelers. David Carr has been playing very well. He has been finding Cooper and Crabtree, so Crabtree becomes a very viable option. He's starting for Drew right now in the flex position. There are a couple of bye weeks on Drew's team right now. So Michael Crabtree is a very good plug-and-play start for Drew's roster this week. Now looking at the downside, as I mentioned, there are a couple of buys for Drew's team right now. Devonta Freeman is out. Frank Gore is out. So it really becomes a decision of either Alfred Blue or Ronnie Hillman to start. Drew is going to go with Blue, who is playing in the Monday night game at Cincinnati. That's a tough matchup for them. Cincinnati is certainly playing very well. It's going to be difficult for the Houston Texans to remain in that ball game. So what it will come down to is Drew will need him to catch passes out of the backfield. The problem with that is that there's Chris Polk. There's other running backs involved there in the Houston backfield. So it's not a lock that Alfred Blue is going to have a big game. So for that reason, I'm putting him in the down category for his roster. Now looking at Bill's team, I like Calvin Johnson this week. Historically, he has played very well against Green Bay. That's who he's playing against this week. Green Bay's defense has been torched the last couple of weeks. Certainly, they played some very tough competition in Denver and Carolina. This is a road game for Calvin Johnson, but again, historically, he has done very well against that team. Green Bay's defense right now in shambles, so that seems like a lock-in start for Calvin Johnson this week for Bill's roster. Now, looking at the downside, Charcandrick West has performed very well since Jamal Charles has gone down with a season-ending injury. However, the matchup that he has this week is very challenging. He's playing on the road in Denver. That's going to be a tough game for the Chiefs to remain competitive in. Certainly, this isn't the Denver of old. They did lose last week. Peyton Manning is banged up, as we mentioned. So for me, West, I'm going to go out on a limb. I don't think he's going to have a huge game. He will come in around 10 points, maybe a little bit underneath that total for Bill's roster. Now, looking at this matchup, I think it's going to be very close. The projected score is about 10 right now. Bill doesn't have a defense in there. He'll make a change. He'll add that defense. This becomes essentially a pick'em game. Now, I'm very concerned about Drew starting Alfred Blue, as I mentioned, but I'm going to take him to win. This is going to be a very close game. I'm going to ride Demaryius Thomas and Alshon Jeffrey to remain in a winning streak to move to 8-2 on the fantasy football season. Now, the final matchup that we have is, of course, the matchup of the week, brought to you by, of course, DraftKings. Looking at Adam's roster first, who comes in with a record of 4-5. He's lost a couple of players due to injury, but he's still alive in the fantasy playoff position here. Looking at Adam's roster, I like David Carr this week. I talked a little bit about him earlier with that success of the Oakland offense. He has a very favorable matchup. He is playing against Minnesota at home. He's been really lights out. He's been throwing a lot of touchdown passes, throwing for over 300 yards. David Carr has really come into his own as a viable fantasy football starting quarterback. So I like for that to continue this week against Minnesota. Looking at the downside, Adam has to start Eric Ebron due to the Antonio Gates bye situation this week for San Diego. Ebron is at Green Bay. It is a favorable matchup. However, right now Detroit has a new offensive coordinator. Eric Ebron was barely looked at last week. That does not bode well for his chances this week for Adam's team. He's projected at a very low total. I think he could either get to that total or underneath that total for Adam's roster. Now, Bud, who comes in with a record of 5-4, has lost, I believe, 3 straight games. So he desperately needs a win. This is a very important matchup for Bud. And I like what Aaron Rodgers is going to bring to the table. The Packers have lost 2 games in a row. Rodgers is pissed off. Rodgers is going to have a good game, and he has an incredible matchup with Detroit at home. He's going to be lights out. It's going to be the old Aaron Rodgers. I think you're going to see him throw at least 3 touchdown passes in this game. He will come in at least with 23 fantasy points. Now, looking at the downside for Bud's team, he's been very banged up at the running back position, and this week he's going to start Shane Vereen. As much as I love when players play against their old teams, I just don't see Vereen having a huge game. I think they're going to spread the ball around. I think they're going to throw it a lot. I know Vereen is effective at catching passes out of the backfield, but I think where he's at in terms of his projection is around 10 points. I think that's pretty accurate in terms of what he's going to bring to the table. So I just don't see it being a huge day for Vereen. It's a guy that I think will be okay, but maybe not to the level that Bud is going to need him to be at, especially with all the injuries that he's dealing with right now in his roster. Looking at the projected total of this game, it's very close. It's essentially a pick'em game for these two gentlemen. I'm going to take Bud's team. There's too many fill-in guys at the wide receiver position right now for Adam, and including his tight end with Eric Ebron. So I'm going to take Bud's team to win. He's going to move to 6-4 with this win, and it's really going to put Adam in a very difficult position if he hopes to make the fantasy playoffs. So that's the action as I see it. This is a song for Cam to bring back the glory days of the New Jersey Devils. I got my beard ready to go for Movember. That's going to be at the end of the month, so you should be seeing that soon. And again, a reminder, last week to make trades. The deadline is Saturday. Best of luck to everyone out there. And of course, enjoy the action.